Continuing our work sessions, we're moving on to the biannual code updates with April.
And I'm not actually presenting today. Brent Davis, our land use and wetland habitat manager, will do most of the presenting. We do have a public works piece of this, and so they should be presenting their own possibly. So I will introduce Brent Davis, who's on virtually.
Good morning, councilors. My name is Brent Davis. I'm the Land Use Review Manager in Community Development. And what I'm presenting to you today is a batch of what we call biannual code updates. So periodically we gather information where we find items in the county code that are either not clear or require minor clarification, sometimes some Scrivener's errors, and occasionally some relatively straightforward items where we need to make some changes to be consistent with changes in state law. And in addition to that, there's the opportunity for what we call minor policy items. And these are items that are relatively minor, but could have some policy implications. So we categorize those separately. So what I'm going to do in the presentation is just briefly go over the scope of the proposed changes. You have a packet with more detail. And then when we get to the minor policy items, Hunter Decker, the county forester, is going to present a couple slides because that is probably the most significant item in this batch. All right. So next slide, please. So just a little bit about the process. So we, over time, we gather proposed changes. They can come from you, the council. They come from staff as we do our work. We find things that are challenging to interpret, or we find errors. The Development Engineering Advisory Board has an opportunity to bring these things forward to us, as well as other customers that are working on their own applications. So we call these biannual code updates because for a time they were occurring twice a year. Now we do it less frequently, generally when we get critical mass of items or some items that we feel need attention and need to get dealt with within a reasonable time frame of when we discover them. So once we have a list of items gathered, we prepare preliminary draft updates, which is the handout that was provided to you. And there is one late item that was added yesterday that I will go over towards the end of my presentation. And then we're here with you today to present the list of items and to get some initial feedback on whether or not we should proceed with all these items or potentially pursue a different direction. And once we have that approval with the list of items to move forward with, we'll be presenting the list to DEEB in their March meeting. We'll be issuing a 60-day notice to the Department of Commerce for proposed changes to Title 40. That's a statutory requirement. We'll commence legal review of final drafts of the code changes in ordinance format, and we'll initiate the SEPA process and get it on the Planning Commission schedule for a work session and a hearing for Title 40 amendments. Again, that's a statutory requirement for our development code. And then at some point, we'll be coming back to council for a hearing with proposed ordinance. If there's any substantial changes in the process or the council wishes to take a final look at these before we go to hearing, we certainly can schedule another work session after the Planning Commission. Next slide, please. So here's an overview of the non-minor policy changes for this batch. We have some changes to Title 32, which is our code enforcement statute. These are essentially addressing some gender references and removing gender from references to things like the hearings examiner. In addition to that, there's still language referring to the county commission in this code, and we're correcting that to county council. As far as Title 40 goes, we're proposing a minor change to the Type 2, Type 3 timeline standards. This is in response to Senate Bill 5290, which was adopted or passed in 2023 and went into effect at the beginning of this year. Our code states that when we request additional information in the middle of an application process, we can stop the clock, which is consistent with the new state statute. However, our code says that once we get the submittal in response to that request, we can take an additional 14 days to review the completeness of that submittal, and that is no longer allowed under state statute. So we're proposing to remove that language. We're proposing to update the time limit for expending impact fee revenue. Our current code is not consistent with state statute, and state statute actually gives us more time than we currently have. And I have staff from Public Works available if there's questions about that. We're proposing some changes to the urban accessory dwelling unit standards that were adopted or updated fairly recently. We found some inconsistencies with the state law. So we have some changes there to ensure that we're in compliance. And then lastly, we're clarifying some language regarding allowance for townhouses in the low density residential districts at the threshold at which those can be allowed without a planned unit development. Next slide, please.
Brent, I think we have a question here.
If it's okay, if you
Go
want
ahead.
us to continue on, I can hold it till the end, but it's up to.
What's your pleasure, Brent? Question now or wait till the
Question's
end?
fine, please.
Go ahead.
Okay, if we could go back to the last slide. Yes, so thank you. So type 2 and 3 timelines for application holds under new state law. I'm wondering if you can just expand on that a little bit. And then kind of what I'm interested in is, first of all, I'm not quite sure exactly what those timelines are, but I'm wanting to make sure that if there's flexibility for us and it's feasible to have them as short as possible, not necessarily just meeting the state law, but even going further to try to reduce those times. I'm just wondering what our capacity for that is.
So right now, our current standards are well below the state thresholds. We have not proposed to change those overall timelines. So for type 1 reviews, which are purely administrative decisions with no public notice, our code gives us 21 days to complete that process, and state statute gives us 65 days. For our type 2 applications, which is an administrative decision with a public notice, our code gives us 78 days, state statute gives us 110 days. And then for our type 3s, which is a public hearing process, our code gives us 92 days and state statute gives us 170 days. So what we're proposing for this change here will actually shorten the timeline because we are no longer able to add time to the clock after we get a submittal in response to a new information request.
So it will reduce the time period even further from what we currently have.
Correct.
Well, that is excellent news. Thank you.
I can see April nodding with some pride in that.
Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
Brent, thank you. First of all, the third bullet point under Title 40 Urban ADU standards consistent with state law, those zoning changes within the urban growth boundary, is that correct? In unincorporated Clark County?
It's in the urban growth area, the unincorporated urban growth area.
Mm-hmm.
They're not zoning changes. There's changes to the approval criteria for accessory dwelling units. So A couple of items just to go over the actual individual changes. One is we need to update our definition of an urban ADU to be consistent with the state law. Our current code says that it is accessory to a detached single family housing unit, but the state statute includes duplexes, triplexes, and townhomes. So based on our current definition, we're not allowing ADUs where state statute says we have to. So that's one change. And then the next one is actually in our medium density districts because the state statute now indicates that we have to permit those in any district where a single family home is allowed. Our current use table says accessory dwelling units in those districts are subject to a process we call review and approval, which is applies some additional approval criteria that are kind of overarching. It's a higher level review than a standard permit, but it's not quite what we call a conditional use permit. But state statute says we have to permit those in these districts if we allow single family homes in those districts. So we're proposing to change the use table to make those permitted in those districts. And that's our medium density residential and office residential districts.
Thank you.
And then, yeah, there's a few more if you.
Cool.
Yeah, so the applicability standards for ADUs, we do have to update them to include duplexes, triplexes, and townhomes. And then lastly, there's a provision in the state statute that says we cannot impose any design standards or setback standards on an ADU that does not apply to the primary dwelling. And we had some language in the code specifying when an ADU could be placed in front of a home and when it couldn't. And we found that that violates the state statute. So we're simply going to be applying the same zoning setbacks and design standards that we would apply to the primary dwelling.
Thank you.
All right. Any more questions?
I think we're good for now.
Okay. So moving on to proposed minor policy changes. We have a couple of items in Title 40. The first is a update to the Forest Practices Code, and Hunter Decker, the county forester, is actually here to present a couple slides on that specifically after this slide. The next item is our temporary hardship code. We're proposing to add a little more flexibility for allowing a existing permanent structure to be used as a temporary hardship. Generally, those are intended to be like manufactured homes, removable structures when the hardship is done. However, we get cases occasionally where somebody's building a new home and they need a hardship, and in order to do it, they technically would have to tear down their old home, which is a perfectly functional home, and then put in a manufactured home for the temporary hardship. So we're proposing an allowance to allow them to temporarily retain that existing dwelling and use it for a hardship with a covenant that they will convert it to a non-dwelling structure once the hardship is over. And then the last one is some of the new middle housing standards require guest parking. And we've seen some cases come in where developers are proposing to place that parking adjacent to and directly connected to a public or private street. And in some cases that it's been head-in parking, and we've had some cases where they've wanted to put the sidewalk between the parking stalls and the roadway. And we've been able to work with them to get that changed, but we are proposing to add a requirement in the sidewalk standards that if there's off-street parking that is not, it's not in the right of way, for middle housing that they have to route the sidewalk around the parking as opposed to behind it. And then the last item in Title 6, which is our fee code, we're proposing to add a late fee for overdue fire marshal invoices. So when the fire marshal goes and does their annual inspections for businesses, they don't get paid for those in advance. They bill for them after the fact. And it's been recommended that we institute a late fee in order to address costs associated with collections if those invoices aren't paid in time. All right, next up is Hunter regarding the forest practice ordinance.
Hi, good morning. I'm Hunter Decker, Clark County Forester for Public Works. This piece of code I've been managing for the past 8 years when I came upon here with the county. And I was, just a little brief history. I came on board to be an intern for the county forester at the time that had 20 years of experience and had written this code. And he passed away early. In that internship was about 4 months in. And so I've assumed a lot of the code, but we haven't had a lot of defined, like, this is how it's done. And so in the past 8 years, we've kind of come up and found some inconsistencies related to the state law. And so looking at these, we've wanted to go through and find the key issues with our class 1 exempt forest practices, our class 4 general conversion permits that convert forest land to another use, and align the SEPA and shoreline management regulations so they're concurrent with our Growth Management Act, as well as address some of the outdated code references related to water stream typing and reforestation. And so that would then bring it into compliance with state law. Next slide, please. I guess I kind of went over most of that, and with the updates would consolidate the class 1 inspection fees, which have always been included in the fee, so it was never an added fee on top of that. So we're removing that. So if you have any questions, I'm here to answer those for you.
Any questions? Go ahead, Counselor.
Yeah, I noticed you had spent a lot of time here, so I wanted to give you a chance to explain any of those in real terms. If you want to give any examples of some of the changes that you're talking about here.
Sure. So, sure. So for instance, there's a class 1 application which goes up to 2 acres, and anything that's more than 2 acres would then be a class 4 general. And back when I came aboard, the county wasn't looking at the class 1s as conversions. And so to make that concurrent with state law, we needed to process those as a class 4. And so in the guidance within our code, it doesn't have that process where what do we do with a class 1? It just says that we administer it, but then it references like a class 4 a little bit. And then it goes into that land conversion language, which is the next section. So adding the class 1 with the class 4 generals. So anything that's smaller than 2 acres would be considered a class 1 application conversion, which would not go through SEPA. And anything that's more than that then would go through that process. And so trying to align that together.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you very much.
Brent, we muted you. If you can unmute yourself and restate.
Would it be possible to get the memo I submitted yesterday up before we finish this next slide? Thank you. So we did have one late addition to the clarification section of the biannual code updates, which is on the screen here. This is in reference to how school impact fees are calculated, and specifically the definition of the student factor in that calculation. We had a request from an outside attorney who represents a number of school districts to add some flexibility to allow for alternate methodologies for calculation, primarily because the statute does require us to treat single family and multifamily differently, but the language regarding how it's calculated doesn't make that clear. In addition, some districts are employing demographic information when they're looking at calculating their student factor to account for things like, say if they happen to have a disproportionate amount of new senior housing, that could affect how they would anticipate to gain new students from that new housing. So we're just proposing to allow for additional other methodologies that have been approved by the county in those calculations. In addition to that, we're proposing to eliminate this requirement that the student factor be recalculated annually. Generally, that's because we are only seeing requests for changes in these impact fees in conjunction with school capital facilities plan updates, which the last one was, I believe, in 2022 or 2023. So it's something it's done periodically as the school districts decide they need to get these impact fees updated. Any questions about this one?
Any questions? I think we're good on that score.
All right. We go back to
Okay.
the slides, please. Yeah, thank you. So what we're requesting today is for the council to identify any items they would like to see revised, removed, or potentially tabled for future consideration, and then authorization to proceed with the process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that specific request. Any guidance from the council? Go ahead, Councilor Young.
Great, thank you. I have a quick question. This is something I've always wondered and I've always forgotten to ask, but so for example, if somebody owns a single family house and it meets the specific criteria of an ADU, can somebody then build a house? If that makes sense. So in reverse order, I've always wondered if that was a possibility. And the reason I look at this is, for the potential for somebody to grow, they able to buy a piece of land and maybe they build what they can afford to at the beginning, multifamily oriented, and they can grow into something behind it or in front of it or however, that kind of flexibility. I'm wondering if that is allowed in our code.
I don't see why not.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you can't build it as an ADU because an ADU is an accessory to a main. But if you had it, lived in it, 1,000 square feet, and then you want to build a bigger home, then yeah, as long as the occupancy of the new home is going to be dependent on that. But yeah.
Awesome. Don't need to make any changes then. Thanks.
Councilor Little.
Yeah, I do just want to bring up one thing that I've sent by email for the equestrian community. Just hoping in the future we can provide a little bit more clarity to that community. And this is for more explanation. It's just for open air equestrian facilities that are used for personal use mostly, but they may help out nonprofits or children with disabilities or at-risk youth with a couple charitable donations each year, and just trying to get some clarity for those situations that they may not have to jump through as many hoops or qualify as commercial Just try to get some clarity for that community on what they would and would not have to implement versus regarding sound barriers, sprinkler systems, emergency exits, and things like that. So just looking for a little bit clarity. I know you're looking into that right now, but I just wanted to say that publicly.
Kathleen, do you have any background on that? Because I know there were issues that came up a few years ago.
Yes.
There
Yeah.
was a work group that came together. It wasn't clear to me whether or not there were any changes implemented.
So what I can share is, yes, there was something about over 5 years ago, because it was right at the beginning of COVID, I think is when we did the listening session with that community. And the staff at the time, who are no longer with the county, misapplied the code. And so April and her team are applying the code, which does change what was communicated more than 5 years ago. There are still some restrictions based on size, whether it's a horse facility or a home with regards to sprinkler systems and stuff. That is standard already in the code. But yes, and I would just say, I would encourage, if you're getting any questions on it, April's staff is more than happy to meet and talk to anybody who has questions and help them through the process.
If there could be some clarification of what was misapplied that is now changed, I'd appreciate that because I get those questions from time to time. So
We can put out a Q&A.
great.
Yep.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions? Go
Chair,
ahead.
in the handout, we're missing page 4. It was on the screen. Do you mind going back to it? Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to take a quick look at it because we did talk about this. Okay. Thank you.
I have a question from something that came up maybe a couple years ago related to dark skies and the downward facing lighting. I don't recall what came of that issue.
I believe that we had biannual code recommendations that we brought to Deeb, and we really didn't land on anything that Deeb thought could be followed through with. If we do, we could easily put it back in and we can show it to you. It would only be for new construction. It wouldn't apply to anything before that. But Deeb didn't come up with a recommendation saying, this is workable when we did bring it to them after we brought it to you for the first work session. But we do have the language to be able to put it back in.
Great. I think it would be worthwhile to take a look at that. It was something that a majority of the council was interested in pursuing. So it'd be good to look at that, and then we can hear directly from Deeb and evaluate that. Comment?
Yeah, I remember I actually tuned into that meeting, but I cannot remember exactly what their objection was, but I'm definitely interested in looking at it again as well.
Do we have one more counselor? And also, if we do you want this to be brought back before the hearing to see if anything you want incorporated in the hearing on these code changes?
Would this be something that would be included in the biennial?
Yes, and
This
the
could
previous
be.
council did see that language.
And opted to not move forward with it at that time?
No, they said to go to Deeb
Okay.
and I think it might have been on Deeb's work plan. And then, so we didn't add it on here because of Deeb's comments, but we have the language and.
It just never came back to the council
Correct.
to
Yep.
make a decision about. So that would be good.
Okay.
Are there 3 counselors now that would like to see that language?
Yes.
And would you like to see it before the public hearing on these changes?
Yes, please.
Okay.
I'd also, it'd be nice to get just kind of a little tidbit from Deeb to exactly why. I cannot remember what their thought process was on that.
We record those, so I'll go through and.
Thank
Yep.
you.
It'd just be good to close that loop one way or the other. Okay, any other guidance? I think my sense is that you have the nod of the council to move forward with these proposed changes, and unless I see anybody saying anything differently, and I'm not, so just move forward and we'll pick it up next time. Thank you.
Thank you.